Well, good morning. My name is Steve, and now I can say I'm one of the pastors here at CRBC. And man, it has been a busy weekend. I hear the men's retreat went well. Good job, guys. I also heard that the youth training weekend went well in Parksville. Good job, or Nanaimo rather. Good job, all those who attended. We have a lot of stuff going on, and it is so great just to see what God is doing. We've started this sermon series called Parables, Stories with Jesus. And today we're talking about forgiveness. Wah, wah. I kind of feel like this sermon needs to be preached every month, maybe every week for some of us. It kind of felt like as I was preparing, the gutters are overflowing and, I got to do that again. The maintenance light on the car is on again. Got to get the oil changed. It seems like this is a sermon that I need to hear every single day because things happen. Things come up in my own life. I'm like, no. Really? I'm angry. I'm bitter. I'm a little on edge. I need to forgive again, Jesus? Well, today we're going to ask the questions. Are there times when you should not forgive someone? Are there times when you should not forgive someone? And the other question is, how many times should you forgive someone? Well, Jesus answers these questions. When I was a kid, one of my friends got this rock tumbler. Here's a photo. So he would find all these rough rocks and he would place them in this tumbler. When you add water and grit, you put them in, you let them tumble for days and weeks, it transforms the rock. It takes those rough edges off. It polishes them. It refines them. It transforms them. I was always amazed as a kid. Whatever rock you'd kind of find abandoned on the side of the road, and you put it in there, and it would come out beautiful, sparkling. You would see these inner minerals start to come out. But how many times does the rock need to tumble before it comes out smooth and beautiful? How many times does it have to work through the grit and rub up against other rocks so those rough edges start to break down, so the beauty inside starts to be exposed? How many times does the rock need to tumble? How many times do we need to forgive before we are changed? How many times do we need to be immersed in what Jesus has done on the cross? How many times do we need to go, oh, he forgave me, therefore I need to forgive? How many times do we need to really let the gospel infuse the cracks in our heart and the brokenness, and so we let it go, and so that beauty can come out? How many times do we need to forgive? That's exactly what Peter asked Jesus. And it's because forgiveness is this complex process. When someone hurts us, we do not know what to do. We love to hold on to anger. We love to hold on to our misery. And when we don't deal with our hurt and pain, it negatively affects us, our health, our relationship with God, our relationship with each other. And Jesus is going to show us that when we struggle to forgive, we need to tumble in the gospel. We need to be reminded over and over what he has done for us. We need to let it seep into the cracks of our broken heart. We need to be changed and transformed by going over and over, forgiving over and over, and going, oh, he forgave me, therefore I need to forgive. Before we start, I want to define forgiveness. What is forgiveness? Because it's often misunderstood. But let's start with what forgiveness is not. Forgiveness is not excusing the behavior. Forgiveness doesn't mean we condone the offense. We're not saying that was okay. But we are saying the consequences of your behavior belong to God, not to us. And when we forgive, we release the wrongdoer from our own system of justice, and we leave the matter to God. We're saying forgiveness is not forgetting what happened. It would be foolish to erase from our minds some of the wrongdoings done to us. And if we were to do so, we would never learn. But what we are saying, we can eventually forget those raw emotions associated with what was done. And we can let, again, the gospel infuse us and say, no, I'm not going to take revenge. No, I'm going to leave that to God, but I'm not going to forget necessarily. For example, if someone was to take one of my family members and murder them, to be extreme, I will not forget that. I would have to work through some process of forgiving over and over and over, and it wouldn't happen overnight. But I don't think the gospel is saying to forget it. It's saying to release it. And this is why forgiveness is also not restoring trust in a person necessarily. The trust is built over time. It's not saying it's impossible, but trust is earned. And to blindly trust someone who has hurt you is naive and irresponsible. But again, through forgiveness and reconciliation, trust can be rebuilt. Trust can be given back. But it's also not agreeing to necessarily reconcile. That forgiveness is a necessary step towards reconciliation. But there are some situations in which reconciliation is not possible. It's not necessarily wise. However, and I want to say that again, however, all things can be repaired through the Spirit of God. That God has a way of making the impossible possible. And some things that I've seen as a pastor, I'm like, oh, there's no way that they can reconcile. I've seen it happen. And some of the impossible situations that we carry and that are so heavy, I have seen God do a miracle. Husbands and wives, family members, church members. But it starts with forgiveness. So then what is forgiveness? Forgiveness is the process by which a person is releasing the consequences of the offense. The Greek word for forgiveness literally means to let go. To let go of what the person does, but not demanding payment for it. So here Peter is. He's asking Jesus the question, how many times should I forgive? How many times? Verse 21, this is what it says. Then Peter came up and said to him, Lord, how often will my brother sin against me and I don't forgive him? As many as 7 times? And then Jesus said to him, I do not say to you 7 times, but 77 times. Now, there's actually something very interesting going on here. Peter kind of comes up. He's like, you know what? I'm going to be better than the rabbis. Jesus, I'm going to forgive 7 times. The rabbis told me that I only had to forgive 3 times. And then Jesus kind of spins the whole thing. Actually, Peter, 7 times isn't enough. We need to forgive 77 times. What is Jesus actually saying here? Is he actually saying, keep a record, and as soon as you get to 78, boom, gone, stop forgiving? The relationship is over. No, he's not. The number 7 symbolizes something. Remember, this is a parable. It symbolizes fullness and perfection. So Jesus' use of this number implies unlimited forgiveness. He's implying that he's coming to bring and make things right. In other words, Jesus is saying that if you want to experience God's forgiveness, you need to forgive. Forgiveness is the way of his kingdom. Let me show you something interesting that I also learned this week. The Bible is such a beautiful book. The Old Testament sets up the New Testament. It's one grand story that points to Christ. It's this historical document that records how every time people think they know better than God, and then they wander away, and then God's like, oh, okay, back. Then they wander, and then God brings them back. In Genesis 4:24, it says this: if Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. And some scholars are saying that Jesus is referencing the domino effect of revenge. What do we know about Cain? He killed his brother. Why? Because he was jealous. What do we know about Lamech? He also killed a man for wounding him. And if Cain is avenging 7 times, then Lamech 77 times, Jesus is showing us something. The way of the world is if someone hurts you, you hurt them back. If someone makes you feel jealous or a certain way, you take what is yours and you take revenge. And God stops the cycle. He says, if you continue that cycle, I will take revenge. I will be the judge. And this is exactly what Jesus is telling Peter. Stop the cycle. Stop the revenge. Stop the bitterness. Jesus is telling Peter that he's reversing the way of revenge. Jesus is showing us that the human way of dealing with things, unforgiveness, getting even, it breaks things down. It breaks relationship. It breaks what we have that God said was good. And Jesus is showing us that God's kingdom brings this unexplained, undeserved forgiveness. And God came to undo the brokenness. He came to make the bitter sweet. And what do? We love adding to the wreckage. We love getting even. We love bringing people down when we don't get what we want or things don't go our way. And Jesus is saying, no, Peter, there's a better way. I want to reverse that. You know, some of us like to keep lists. Grocery lists, honey to-do lists, lists for birthday parties. But do we keep lists of offenses? Maybe you don't write them down, but in your heart, all the things, all the bad things that have happened to you. Do we mull them over at night? Kind of go over all the ways that we're mad and angry and how we can get even? Maybe it's with your spouse, a family member, a church member? No. That doesn't happen here, right? Someone at work? You know, Peter is struggling with the same thing. He's asking Jesus, how long does the list need to be? And Jesus is like, no, scrap the list. I get a better way. It's forgiveness every single time. Forgive. Release. And Jesus is saying, I forgave you not once or twice, but I've forgiven you every single time you've come to me. And the way of the kingdom is not holding on to faults and wrongdoings. The way of the kingdom is releasing. It's practicing forgiveness over and over and over again. And as we practice forgiveness, man, sometimes our heart doesn't catch up. That's why we need to take the next step again and again and again until our heart catches up with what Jesus is doing for us. Sometimes we need to repeat, reiterate, and learn to let go. Told you probably need to hear this every week. Next, what is it like to receive forgiveness? What is it like to receive forgiveness? Verse 23, here Jesus starts to tell the parable, the story. He starts to illustrate forgiveness. He says, therefore, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king, and he's the king, who wished to settle accounts with his servant. When he began to settle, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. And since he could not pay, his master ordered him to be sold with his wife and children and all that he had, and payment to be made. So what's going on here? Well, Jesus is telling a story of a man who cannot pay back his debt. Most scholars are saying it's this large, massive debt, millions and millions of dollars. Some say even close to $1 billion. In other words, it's absolutely impossible for him to pay it back. And here he is before the king. And the king is demanding payment. It's like missing your mortgage payment. It's like, all right, you've missed 1, 2, 3. Sorry, we're taking the house. Or we're shutting off the electricity because you can't pay it back. And the master's saying, actually, because you can't pay it back, I own you. I own your family. And historically speaking, that's exactly what happened. Verse 26, so the servant fell on his knees, imploring him, which means begging. And he says, have patience with me. I will pay you everything, which is impossible. And out of pity for him, the master of the servant releases him and forgives the debt. Notice that the servant humbled himself, begged. And the king forgave. As Jesus was telling parables, there were people listening in. It wasn't just him and Peter having this conversation. You can almost hear the crowd saying, no king would do that, Jesus. No king would forgive such a debt. No king would let him go free. No king would have that much grace. No king on this earth would. But can you imagine that kind of forgiveness? Can you imagine being forgiven for millions and millions of dollars that you owe? For something that you cannot pay back? Now, how many of you have been pulled over by a police officer? That was a test. This side wins. This side's lying a little bit. And maybe you've ran a stop sign. Maybe you were speeding. Maybe there's another reason that you don't want to tell. But have you been pulled over and been guilty for some kind of offense? You know, Megan and I were talking. I'm like, how many times have you been pulled over? She said 4 times. Then she asked how many times I've been pulled over, and I think I've lost count. But you know what I noticed? Out of the 4 times that she's been pulled over, she's been let off 3 times. How is that possible? Every single time I've been pulled over and guilty, I've been let off once. And I did not cry. But how does it feel when you've been let off? Good, someone said. Right? It feels like a breath of fresh air. You know, something heavy has been lifted off. You want to celebrate. You're like, I'm free. Thank you, officer. That's what the servant is feeling. When the king's like, you've been forgiven. I want you to reflect on what it means to be forgiven. Being released from the consequence of your actions. It's refreshing. It's freeing. It's life-giving. It changes everything for you. It changes things in your relationship. When you go, you know what, I forgive you. I release that. We're okay. It changes things between you and God where you're not carrying these heavy burdens around going, poor me. They did this to me, to me, to me, to me. It mends things for you. It releases things for you. And this is what it's like to receive forgiveness. You know, I read an interesting stat from 200 married people that practice forgiveness. And they found that as people practice forgiveness, people who are married reported fewer symptoms of depression and anxiety and fatigue just by forgiving one another. So the next question is, do we give our forgiveness? Do we forgive others? Let's keep reading. Verse 28. But when the same servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii and seized him. He began to choke him, saying, "Pay what you owe." So his fellow servant fell down and pleaded with him, "Have patience with me. I will pay you." And he refused and went and put him into prison until he should pay the debt. Interesting. The very person that received forgiveness from the king, who couldn't pay back this massive debt, comes out of the kingdom, and there he sees a servant who owes him like $20. And what does he do? He doesn't forgive him. What? In fact, he punishes him until he can pay back his debt. And what the interesting thing is, that servant could actually pay back the $20. But the servant that was forgiven, there's no possible way that he could pay back what was owed. Some people said, notice that the wording was exactly the same. The second servant humbled himself He begged. He said, pleaded, please let me off. And the servant said, no. In verse 31, it said that people that were watching were greatly distressed, and we keep reading. Then the master is called in, and the master says, you wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. And should not you have mercy on your fellow servant, as I had mercy on you? And in anger, his master delivered him to the jailers until he should pay all his debt. And verse 35 is key. It says, so also my heavenly Father will do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother from your heart. So what is Jesus saying in this parable? Jesus is saying to be on the receiving end of forgiveness, but not on the giving end of forgiveness, is wicked. It's sinful. It's wrong. He's saying that holding on to resentment is this horrible thing that breaks us down. And if you do not forgive, you will not be forgiven. In other words, the pardon of God, when understood, is life-changing. It spills out of our life into other people's lives. In other words, we cannot go through heaven's narrow door holding on to resentments, carrying bitterness, being unforgiving. But God puts his precious gift of forgiveness in our hands. He goes, here, what are you going to do with it? How are you going to respond when someone hurts you? Are you going to respond with anger? Are you going to hold on to it? Are you going to make them pay? Are you going to get even? Jesus is saying, no, that's the way of the world. It's not living in freedom. It's living in bondage. It's living with you trying to be the judge and jury. It's you actually trying to be God. Someone said this, in any polarized situation, the overriding human tendency is to draw a line between us and them. You know, people rally the troops on their team, everyone else rallies the troops on their team, and then we go to war. We fight. Václav Havel, the former president of Czech Republic, did the opposite. And some people were pretty frustrated with his forgiveness. Some even blamed him for this. And this is what he said as he maintained his position in war. He said, the line between good and evil did not run clearly between them and us, but through each person. In other words, we are all marked by sin. We all bring sin to the table. Every conflict, every argument, every fight, man, we have sin in us. You know, we're so easy to like, oh, I'm good. I did nothing wrong. No. There's sin in you. You're not loving the way Christ did. You're not forgiving the way Christ forgave. Oh, there's sin in you. And the gospel calls us to not just us and them, but causes us to forgive, calls us to lay down our weapons and make amends and go, you know what? I'm a sinner saved by grace, and so are you. I choose to love. N.T. Wright says this, forgiveness is not the same thing as tolerance. Being forgiven doesn't mean that sin doesn't matter. On the contrary, forgiveness means that sin does matter, but that God is choosing to set it aside. And to go further, chooses to send his son to die payment for our sin. So the question is, are there times when you should not forgive someone? According to Jesus, the answer is no. And Jesus is showing us that we can't claim to be forgiven, and our actions are not changed by his forgiveness. So how long do we need to tumble and be immersed in the gospel before we understand that we need Jesus' forgiveness in every area of our life, every single day, every moment? That our sin affects every relationship, every argument, every conflict. It colors it. It polarizes it. So what does it mean to actually forgive someone? David Augsburger says this, or Augsburger. To see the other as having worth again, regardless of wrongdoing. To see the other as having value in spite of the pain felt. It means to cancel demands on the past, recognizing that the unchangeable is impossible. It means to work through anger and pain felt by both, and repentance is seen by both to be authentic. It means to drop the demands for the ironclad guarantee of future behavior. It means to feel moved by warmth and love and compassion. It means to celebrate in a mutual recognition that right relationships have been achieved. But how do we get there? How do we forgive? If I'm being honest, I'm not the best forgiver. Sometimes I stew on things too long. Sometimes I wrestle with it. I get angry and I don't know how to let it go. It can be days, it could be weeks, maybe even a year. And if you're like me, you need God's help to be able to forgive. There's some situations, the wounds are so deep, you cannot do it on your own. Here's some steps. Decide. Make a decision to forgive, to let go of those feelings. And sometimes your head can make that decision and your heart needs to catch up. When you make that decision over and over and over again, when it comes back, no, release. Let go. Choose to give it to God. Don't let the devil have a foothold. Make a decision. Decide, I'm going to set that aside. And if it creeps back, push it away. Number 2, depend on God. Ask the Holy Spirit to help you. Mull it over and go, God, I can't do this on this own. Reveal, remind me of what you did on the cross for me. Preach to yourself. Remember of all the things that you've done against God that He's forgiven you for. Ask for His help. And then obey. Leave it. Tear up the piece of paper. Remember that Christ forgave you. Forgive quickly. I'm going to call the worship team up as we close.